The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. This is Dr. Oba Tashaka. Welcome to the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. We have another important show for you, and this one is an extension and a continuation of the last 3 shows. Before getting into that, I want to again thank my team for making the improvements to this show, particularly the work of Brother Lawrence Freelow with this beautiful gold banner that you see running under the screen. And this banner advertises our address, the day and time for the show, and where you can make financial contributions to the show. And it's also artistic because most of these banners I see on most shows are just huge, got a lot of print on them, and it just uglifies the show. And so I really thank him for putting some artistry in this. And for the last year and a half, this show has been going off my pocket. I put out about $25,000 out of my pocket. And you might think I'm rich. I'm not. I'm a retired professor. Professors don't make a whole lot of money. And I'm not going the corporate route to get the corporations to put their advertisements in it. I've been fighting corporations all my life. So why am I going to be an advertiser for the corporate hitmen? So I would appreciate if people would make a donation to the show so it enables us to cover certain costs that can improve the show. And Brother Cinnabar, I'm straight. I'm not going to need you for today, but if you want to hang in there, it's good. I also want to thank Lawrence Freelow for doing technical work to make the introduction to this show that you see that came on in the beginning of the show. So I want to thank him for that. as well. That took some technical expertise that, to do that. It took him a number of hours to do that. Then I want to again thank my team, starting with Brother Ogawa, for the good work he's doing to boost our subscribers, and especially to increase our subscribers on Twitter. Up until a few weeks ago, Twitter was just a name for us, but now, we're getting Twitter subscribers to the point that the last show, half the viewers came from Twitter, half of them came from Facebook. So Brother Ogawa has done a great job on that. What's interesting about this show is that 30 to 40% of viewers are non-subscribers. And we're in the process of figuring out why, and we got some interesting strategies. And I want Lao Tzu and Brother Ogawa to give me a call later on today, and we can discuss that for dealing with that. So the non-subscribers who are watching the show, hit the subscribers button, and I'll be saying that over and over again. But I think there are also some things we have to do to get more of the non-subscribers to subscribe. Today I'm going to dispense with news items. I'll do that next week. So I want to say to Lao Tzu, welcome. Brother Ogawa, welcome. Chastity Perry, welcome. Dan Freeman, welcome. And all the others who are watching the show, and I'll be noting you when you come on. Stephen McKenzie, welcome. I'm really enjoying this, and people have comments or questions. Be sure to put them up on the side there, on the chat side. So today's show is part of a 4-part series that's going on so far. There may be a 5th, I'll see. This is coming from experience, my own personal, as well as the experience of others in various movements. In the beginning, the Black Power, Black Freedom movement, and Black Studies movement. And then today, the Afrocentric or African-centered cultural renaissance and Afrocentric educational movement, and others. So it's experience-based, but it's also based on my own personal, but the experience of others. So basically, I'm doing this show as an intergenerational reach out. It used to be that the place you would go to get information was the bookstore. Now it's the internet. In this case, the space we're occupying, which is the Afronet. So this is my effort to leave a trail for the younger generation, as well as members of my own generation. But I'm particularly interested in reaching out to the younger generation. So part 1 was entitled, The Black Freedom and Black Power Movements Give Birth and Purpose to Black Studies at San Francisco State University. This is important since that's the mothership of Black Studies and now Afro-centrism. And through looking at Black Studies through that lens, you're really looking at it through the lens of the mother. And since it's held its integrity up, it still is holding up that banner. So the first show was focusing on the connection between the Black Freedom Movement and Black Power Movement's consciousness, and how that consciousness shaped and gave birth to the spirit of Black Studies through students who thought that they could run things, and they could, because they were beginning to gain control of their minds through learning our history and culture. So again, if you haven't been involved in this, that's not how you're going to approach it, because you're not going to know what the mindset of the people were. And that, when we approach anything from a Black or Afrocentric perspective, we're looking at our own standpoint, and you get a lot more when you do that. This first show, which stressed how free minds gave us the sense of power that we could run things, also hinted at the definition of power that is seated in our thoughts that I covered in the last show. The second show drew from my experience and the experience of others in building power, both at the university and community level. And that one was entitled Rules for Building Black Power in Alien University and Black Community Spaces. And so that was me thinking through, what was that process? What were some of the things we had to do? Because when you're in the middle of doing it, you're not going on a prescription or a recipe. You're making moves and building it as you go. And then you get some overall perspective on how to move further, and then a perspective on what you did, So the central point of part two was that a key space that we had to control was the mind space, or the intellectual space, and what level of consciousness we were coming from would really dictate and determine what kind of space we were trying to create. If we were coming from the assimilated mindset that when I did the show on Black Power, I critiqued Henry Louis Gates for coming from, then we're just going to be grateful for occupying space and, see this as a job to perpetuate the European worldview, because that's our frame of reference, but then also to add the Black stuff in. And so Black becomes an appendage to Euro-American culture, when in fact, Black culture in this country is a culture of popular choice of the country and the world, and it's not a subculture, but you operate like it is, subordinate and just made up of a few things that you can show off, while your main work is perpetuating white culture. So it depends on where your head's at, what you do with that space. You either occupy it and treat it like a job, or you own it because you own your mind. And, the last show went into minds as in plural, not the one we're normally thinking of, the purely logical, despiritualized mind. So that was the key point there. And so a lot of people throughout the world would not think about space as a place, of course, that's Sun Ra, for occupying power. Because if you're in Africa or the Caribbean, you got your own land. And of course, in our communities, we have a certain amount. But, the fact is that in critical, hostile territories like the university, which is run on the European model or the Aryan paradigm, that is, it has been exclusively occupied by Europeans and the European mindset. So when you come into that and you've got a clear sense of where your consciousness is, then you see the need to alter that. And that all depends on your state of consciousness. So the sixfold stages to mental freedom, for people that haven't signed up for that, that's very important. That's what this show is based on, the transformation of consciousness. So we're able to do what we did because we came in with a different orientation, a different view. And it's very much tied into what this show's about as well. So part three, and the most important presentation of this series, which was last week, was entitled Afro-centricity, Making the Lower Logical Mind the Servant of the Higher Spirit Mind. This is real key. And so That presentation was in part based on my own personal experience and personal transformation in working to work to develop this higher mind. And it was also based on the transformation of some of our faculty um, who were doing similar work, such as Dr. Wade Nobles. So that presentation put forward a universal definition of power. And I hope people checked it out. And I did a critique of Huey P. Newton's definition, which I used in the first show or the second show. And so I put forward a definition of power, and I'll be building on that in terms of using it for today's show. And I define power as thought that creates who we are, with our highest creative thoughts uncovering cosmic truths that make the complex simple, the abstract practical, and bring beauty where there is ugliness. That last part, bringing beauty where there is ugliness, is a mantra of just about all African American cultural creators. That's a distinct mark for our culture because we had to recreate a culture and an art form under hostile, ugly circumstances that still persist. And so the whole effort to bring beauty where there was ugliness was a major effort to enable us to not only hold on to our humanity, but to rise to higher and higher levels. And so far from slavery destroying our humanity, we not only came out with our humanity intact, we came out with some beautiful inner cultural creations that took us to higher and higher levels of creativity and humanity, while at the same time suffering from the scars of slavery. But it's the second one we always emphasize. It's the first one we too often miss. So all of that, creating who we are and defining who we are through our thoughts, puts us in the position of playing the real role of power, which is not to lord over nature, but to be guardians of Mother Nature and guardians of the cosmos. And to do as Dr. George Washington Carver did, serve as healers of nature, where a little sickness is developed, as he did with plants. He said not a single one that got into his hands ever died or remained ill. He healed them, you know. So in that sense, you become a doctor of nature, but you're not the big doctor. Mother Nature is, and the biggest is God, you know. But that's our role, not to destroy the cosmos, not to destroy nature, not to destroy humanity, but to make it more better. You know what I mean? More better. So, what's today's show? Most of you have received the advertisement put out by Brother Cinnabar, who does these beautiful advertisements with a picture of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop on one side and this book, The Disuniting of America, as he calls it, Reflections on a Multicultural Society by Arthur Schlesinger. And so the topic for this show is Black Power and Afro-centrism is thinking beyond the Aryan cultural model. Black Power and Afro-centrism is thinking beyond the Aryan cultural model. Now, note what I meant in the definition by thinking is creating yourself and doing a lot of creativity around you. And it's also discovery of the higher laws and higher principles that come when we piped into God's mind. So thinking beyond the Aryan cultural model. Aryan is the term that is more appropriate when describing what we call Europeans or whites, because that's their root, Aryan. Europe is a recent phenomenon, and it's something in the process of being made, as the war in Ukraine is an example of, you know. The West doesn't really, the Western Europeans don't have much interest in Eastern Europeans because they're Slavic people, Slavic Aryans, but they're the largest group. And they really don't particularly like the Russians because they've been the strongest of the Slavic people. And Slavic comes from the word slave, the first to be enslaved among them, you know. So to talk about Europe as a whole, if you look at the histories of Europe, it's usually a history of Western Europe, not too much of European or of Eastern Europe. So this idea of Europe as a whole is an idea, kind of like civilization is an idea for Europeans. They can call skyscrapers and armies and money an example of civilization. We say it's civil behavior. And if you haven't got civil behavior, and that was John Henry Clark's definition, you know, if you're civilized, you're civil. And he was a walking, talking, breathing example of that, an exemplar of our culture, a nice man, a gentleman who was always appropriately dressed, tipped his hat to sisters or anyone, you know, of the, the feminine gender, and was always nice as well as brilliant, you know. Now that's civilized, you know. So when we look at the definition of whites or Europeans, the best term is Aryan. As I pointed out before, and there's a lot more to this that comes out in my book on Seba. Their root is Arius, the lords and masters, and then the Aryans. The Arius are the ones who run the Aryans. And both of them have an ethos of domination and control. That is basically their ethos. That is the white ethos, the European ethos, Eastern European, Western European. The Aryans who move into India have the same ethos, though they take over the spiritual views of the Dravidians, or the Dalits, as they prefer to be called now, who were the civilizers and the creators of that civilization, which they have now been reduced to untouchability, a status in the caste system below slavery, you know, and the civilization that they created. But I don't care whether you're talking spiritual talk, religious talk, or whatever kind of talk, your walk is dominance and control. And so just as the Aryans who move out of the Caucasus Mountains move into India, and because the Dravidians didn't have the military power that the Aryans had, they got conquered. You know what I mean? But we fought them off for a long time. You know what I mean? Took 100 years to bring Africa down, and still resisting. And we maintained civilization for over 100,000 years. So let's not get too frantic about the period you're dealing with now, a very short expanse in history. So this show is going to focus on Black power and Afro-centrism. It's going to really focus on how Black studies moved to Afro-centrism. And in the process of that, gave birth to a African-centered Renaissance and an African-centered educational movement. And so it's going to focus on that, because just as Black power was the real background in the Black freedom movement for Black studies, and Black consciousness gave birth to it, so it's the Afrocentric cultural renaissance that hits Black communities rising from it in the 1980s that is the backdrop for the African-centered thrust in the discipline of what formerly was Black Studies. And so this is a movement launched by African and African American scholars. And this movement drew from a historical legacy that would be very important in our people's history. And that historical legacy drew from thinkers like Martin R. Delaney, who was a very important figure in African and African American thought, Edward Wilmot Blyden, the thoughts of Marcus Garvey, the thoughts of Drusilla Dungy Houston, the thoughts of William Leo Hansberry, and a number of others. And so this would be the fountainhead for Black scholars in the United States to draw from, along with many others. So this show is going to describe how Black studies moved to Afro-centrism, and it's going to particularly focus on two features of this period: the African-centered cultural renaissance that our scholars launched, and particularly through the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, and the African-centered educational movement that was launched by the National Black United Front, where I served as national vice chair and laid out the organizing and strategy for a global African-centered educational movement. While at the same time, I was chairing Black Studies at San Francisco State, moving to transform it from Black Studies orientation to an African-centered one. And in the case of Black Studies, the people that aided in that transformation were Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Philip McGee, who was then Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies, and Dr. Nobles' former teacher at Stanford, and a part of the team of African-centered scholars that launched the Black psychology movement. This group at State was made up of Dr. Lawford Goddard, who was Dr. Wade Noble's assistant, Dr. James Todd, who I recruited. We came out of the same graduate program. Professor Vulanlela Wabogo, who helped me with shaping the sixfold stages to mental freedom and is a scholar in his own right. Another who contributed to this shift at San Francisco State was Professor and mural artist Dewey Crumpler, who was one of the greatest mural artists in the world. And the Reverend Dr. J. Alfred Smith Jr., who was co-pastor of Allen Temple Church, one of the best Black churches in the country that's done all kinds of things for Black people. And a brother named Reginald Major, who wrote a book called The Panther is a Black Cat, whose son was a member of the Black Panther Party and who was a member of the radical wing of the NAACP in San Francisco that made up a part of the Black freedom movement. He's passed on. So these are some of the people that made a major contribution to the shift from Black studies to Afrocentrism. So this shift, as I pointed out in previous shows, and this is a misunderstanding in the Black community, that Afrocentrism is abandoning Blackness. And so you get a lot of Blacks saying, well, I ain't no African, or why have you changed your name from Black studies to Africana studies? Or some of them call it African and African American studies. Why? Well, first of all, the discipline did not throw out the baby with the bathwater. So we didn't throw out Black to embrace Afro-centrism. In fact, to be Black is to be African. And all we did was begin to make the hookup for a variety of reasons of Black studies to its African roots, which had been there in some form in its beginning. But for various reasons, conditions that began to occur in the Black community, we needed to draw more deeply from these African cultural and historical roots. So the movement towards Afrocentricity or African-centered thought, not only in the discipline, but in the Black community, was grounded in the cultural unity that exists between African and African American cultures, based on the common origin of humanity that we have coming out of Africa, and a cultural continuity that you find with African cultures in the Western Hemisphere and in the United States. And so we're acknowledging that continuity, but drawing deeper from the roots and from the source, while we're at the same time watering the fruit, which is us, the new African or the African American. And we could hardly ignore Black culture because, and this is the topic for another show, this is going to really raise your eyebrows, because Africans in America, I want you to hear this, have founded a civilization, the most creative on the planet. I'm not going to go into any of this right now. I'm just going to state it as a fact. And if you're a real observant, you would have thought about this already. That's a topic for another discussion. But imagine, you created civilization in the midst of barbarism. Well, that's how you stayed alive. And it's only to the degree that some of us may be sinking into the pit of barbarism that we got a problem. You hear me? Huh? That's a whole nother topic. But think about it. Oh, you created civilization. You better believe it. So the historical context for the movement from Black studies to Afrocentrism, and the historical context for the African-centered cultural renaissance that would rear its head up in the early 1980s, has to do with the post-1968 hits on Black communities in the US and the post-70s and 80s hits that go to Africa and the Caribbean in the form of global institutions, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and others. And so what happens, and this is something, 1968, as we've shown in previous shows, was a turning point in the Black freedom movement. King had chalked up his victories in 65 and had seen then that the movement had to move to a human rights movement. Malcolm had reached similar conclusions that the movement had to go to a human rights movement, both of them concluding that the society needed to be restructured. But neither of them could predict that King, after his death, almost immediately after, and Malcolm, just a few years after his death, 3 years, the Black community would undergo hits of such an extraordinary and savage level that it would put us in a different position. Malcolm's prophecies had not anticipated this. So if we're looking at what's happening in Ukraine, Russia's wrong. What they're doing to the Ukrainian people is bad. But the fact of the matter is, this country has been doing something very similar to us, wholesale attacks on Black communities. Where's the sympathy? Where's the address to Congress? Where's the correction? It's not going to happen since they were directing it, And we're still undergoing those attacks. So what I'm presenting today it's not just a history of a movement, but it's going to give you some clues about some additional things we can do now to revitalize our communities. And it has application to Africa and the Caribbean as well, who have undergone their hits. If you look at Jamaica, the most prosperous island in the Caribbean in the 70s, until the US and the international global institutions hit it and brought it to its knees economically, in part to go after Michael Manley and for many other reasons. Some of the same things happening in Jamaican communities has happened here. The rise of gangs with the import of guns coming from the United States and the drug traffic, CIA intervention, and generally breaking down their economy, you know. So since 68, hostile forces hit Black communities in the United States, and since the late 70s and 80s, hit the Caribbean and hit Africa. And in the United States, I've gone through this before, but I want to put this in a context for the rise of Afro-centrism. And again, this comes from God. And so this is an analysis that's going to be relevant as long as the conditions persist. And in fact, they've gotten worse since this Afrocentric cultural renaissance due to how these hits have affected our community. So since the post-1968 period, Black communities and African nations and Caribbean nations later have been hit by a number of forces, the biggest of which is globalization. And that is the fact that American corporations that are the biggest in the world have begun to practice policies of neoliberalism, where the corporations are gobbling up just about everything that government has produced and training politicians to come in and generally take back anything that the people have. And so Clinton ends welfare, you know. Reagan, you know, cuts back substantially on the housing budget that enabled us to have low and moderate income housing. And of course, if you want to look at Britain, Margaret Thatcher goes in and takes a major hit, carries it out on unions and on various kinds of programs that the government in the UK provided for the people. In fact, they were working together, Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. So poverty is beginning to become more pronounced under the Reagan administration, but it's following the neoliberal policies that were first tried out in Chile and in other countries, and then brought to the United States. And the last big safety net you have in this country, they want to privatize the Social Security. And any of you that think they don't or can't, you've got your head in the sand. Because but for the Iraq and Afghanistan war, Bush would have done it when he had the power to do it. That was his agenda item, you know. So deindustrialization, as I pointed out before, taking the good paying manufacturing jobs and shipping them overseas. The planting of drugs in Black communities, the rise of the prison industrial complex, redevelopment agencies practicing what we called in the 60s Negro removal, and now gentrification. And now a shift of Black populations to a degree from urban centers to suburban centers, where Blacks have had to retreat from urban areas into suburbia because we can't afford the price of housing in the urban centers. I was born in San Francisco. I had to move to Richmond, and then I'm in Oakland, and I'm real glad to be in Oakland. Chocolate City, even though it's reduced in numbers, you know. Oaktown got a whole lot of rich culture. But the fact is, these are all shifts, in this case, migratory shifts, caused by these powerful hostile forces. The counterintelligence program, which took out King and Malcolm, weakened the leadership in Black communities. The Ford Foundation strategy that I note in my book, The Integration Trap, is set up by the by McGeorge Bundy, who had been National Security Council advisor to Kennedy, and one of the real smart boys that come out of Harvard. They put him on a fast track and said he didn't need a PhD. And so from the perch of the Ford Foundation, which is the foundation that really lays out a lot of social and political policies for containing Blacks, they lay out a strategy for replacing militant Blacks with moderate Blacks. And so while Blacks are moving to get mayors, they're moving to make sure that these are moderate, not militant mayors. Bobby Seale nearly got elected Mayor Oakland. But under the Ford Foundation strategy, it was one to prop up leaders that had never represented Black people in anything. Judges who had sent them to jail, ex-cops, some of whom became judges, and so forth. And a few who were good, like Mayor Harold Washington and Baraka's son, who's in Newark right now, doing, I understand, a good job. But in the majority of cases, these people that occupy these offices, they were a part of an effort of the white power elite to shift the militancy that had come out of the Black freedom and Black power movement back into the confines of the system. And it succeeded to a point, because in part, Blacks had also had fear driven into them when they saw the Black Panther Party vamped on and a lot of our leaders killed. So some felt that, they could invest their faith maybe in some leaders that are working for the system, and hopefully they do something for them, which for the most part, they did not. So I've explained before, and this again goes to this definition of power, that is being able to pipe into God's mind, that God told me that these forces that hit us had produced a change in the Black community. And don't go around saying white people deliberately did this. No, this is unintended consequences, with the exception of drugs. They didn't know we had a culture. So this point that God informed me about of the effects of these external forces, these are unintended consequences. And so God said to me through the beautiful light, the forces that hit Black communities, that was Baldwin saying that. God told me, well, that led to a choice between two cultures. And I made the point before, involuntary. Most Blacks didn't know. They were choosing. Some didn't even know they had a culture to choose between, ours and theirs. Didn't know. But that was the unintended consequences of all these forces that hit our community. So for the first time in the history of Blacks in the United States, we were put in the position of choosing between our rich, new African and African American spirit-based, extended family, humanistic, word-based, creative culture, and this mad, Eurocentric, Aryan, despiritualized, materialistic, individualistic, controlling, and violent culture. So the effect of these forces on us leads to some cultural shifts. So what we see as the clearest indication of the effects of these external forces and these cultural shifts is the generation gap between young and old. And I would call this not like the generation gap of whites, in the 60s or in other generations where it's just a matter of the young looking down on the old. No, this is a cultural generation gap, and it's not total, because for the most part, there's been an orderly transition of African American culture from generation to generation, and it still continues. But because of the heavy hit of globalization caused by corporate forces, more than anything, and the other external forces that hit us, we see that there are certain areas of Black youth life that are particularly affected by these hostile external forces. And when new African or African American culture comes in to competition or conflict with this Euro-American mad Aryan culture, then that's where shifts can occur. And so while for the most part, our youth continue new African culture, our youth are race conscious, contrary to what I hear some older blacks saying. Oh, they ain't race conscious. Like hell they aren't. The youth are being thrown in jail. The youth are being shot by the police. The youth are thrown forward a Black Lives Matter movement. And it's been essentially generated by their opposition to racism. You know, the youth is race conscious. You hear me? And some of the real well-read youth are not only race conscious on the level of bare, cold racism, but institutional racism, sophisticated racism, because we open doors for them, and some of them have gone to higher systems of miseducation, and some of them have re-educated themselves and freed their mind. And that's why Black Lives Matter went into the deep political bag of African American culture, group-centered leadership. They've drawn from some of our best stuff. So there's a continuation of culture, and hip hop is another example of it, though not the corporate variety, which all art forms that we put forward have also faced a corporate hit. But the essence of hip hop is coming out of African American or new African culture. But there are a couple of areas where the globalized, materialistic, despiritualized forces, the violent forces that have hit our community, have pushed and brought about cultural shifts. Our culture is a culture where our parents have taught us the human being comes first. My aunt taught her children, people before money. The human being comes first. But today, a whole lot of youth say money comes first. Materialism comes first. Now, there's always been a value for money, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to have some of it. In this society, you can't get honey unless you got money, and that's a shame. And you know what kind of honey I'm talking about, you know, honeys. Of course, sister don't want you to have honeys, honey, you know what I mean? And vice versa. You know, the old saying that we had, we're going to make it if we try. And, you know, the implication is you can make it without anything material. Well, that might work in the romantic phase, but not for very long. No finance, no continuing romance. It's kind of hard to maintain, especially when everything requires money. If you heard the show that we did on Smedley Butler and the other stuff with James Smalls and the poem America the Pimp, and in there, Brother Lodge Daly was saying that even God needs money. He doesn't mean God, he means the church, you know, when they're passing the collection plate. You know what I mean? So on the one hand, the material thing is a reality, but on the other hand, some of us have stepped out of our cultural reality, and money means more than material stuff. And too many of these shows we're seeing on TV now, even some of them that are well scripted, like Power, you know, too much emphasis on the gangster lifestyle, when the people who are putting these things together, like 50 Cent, has been able to really, you know, develop him a living through various things, you know, including making movies. And his script writers are great. But why do the themes always have to be about mama raising a drug dealer who was herself a drug dealer? I know that was his experience, but he has another experience now. But more important, our people have more experiences than that. Why are we just focusing on that? You know what I mean? So this is one area where a significant number of our youth have become wedded to this materialistic idea, yet having none, you know, because their dreams are too often limited to basketball, you know, that they can make a lot of money with the hoops, or hip hop. And neither one is going to provide a livelihood for very many people, you know? So we need to get realistic about what does it take to put bread on the table and a roof over your head. And everybody ain't going to be doing it through playing basketball or any sport or through rapping. Everybody, a lot of youth may think they're the greatest rappers alive. But what does the audience think? And that'll determine whether or not you can make a living on that level. And even if you are, what's the chances of you getting recognized and all the rest of that stuff? So this is a shift that we can call a cultural shift, because you have really sunk into a demonic level when money means more than a human life. And then we have this situation where, because of the powerful forces that have hit our communities, family, church, and school have been weakened. And these are the systems that socialize you. Therefore, peer groups too often have more influence in family, church, and school. And peer groups are looking down too often on their elders. And sometimes elders have also got problems in terms of some of their attitude towards the youth, because some of our elders think that our youth, we own them. And, you know, they belong to us, and no one else has any say-so in their lives. And whereas before it was a community that raised us, your family was primary, but, you know, the elders in the community had a big say-so. So now some of us are saying, don't touch my child, don't look at my child, it's mine. Going to school when the child's acting up yourself, you know what I mean? So some of us are playing the role of children when we're adults. So these are cultural shifts. But by and large, African-American youth are still coming out of this culture. But these hits that our community has faced in terms of these hostile external forces require that we be able to draw on some deep cultural roots for healing and transformation, combined with organizing and programs. So my reading is, because of those who were part of this African-centered cultural renaissance, I was one of the few that had one foot in the world of battles and struggles and organizing, and the other in scholarship. And then, of course, the Spirit guiding me, as it guides a lot of us. And so I could see this movement as responding to something that most of the scholars may or may not have seen. What the scholars generally saw was that this African-centered cultural renaissance was necessary to cure historical amnesia. They saw that. And they realized that we need to restore our memories so that we could have a sense of and a knowledge of who we are. But my reading, based on my students educating me on what I didn't know, leading me to the light of a choice between two cultures, my reading was that this shift away from African and New African values was caused in an underlying way from these external forces that had caused the choice between two cultures. And so from my reading, for healing to occur among our people, then you're going to have to draw from these two roots, the New African, African-American cultural roots, and then going back to its source, the African, and combine that with the organizing programs that we carry out. So since these and other powerful hostile external forces had produced an unintended choice between two cultures, then what our people needed was a return to their deepest cultural roots so that they would have the opportunity to make right cultural choices, both African and African American. And by returning to them, drawing from them, appreciating them more, they could have a better sense of their own sense of power and have more things to draw on to heal the cultural breaks, and more positive values that could strengthen what we already had. So This would have to be hooked up to spiritual, psychological, economic, social, educational programs designed to promote soul healing, healing at the soul level for our people. Now, here's a key point. I always stress on this show that we need to put as much emphasis on knowing and studying our own culture that we've shaped here as we do on ancient Africa. And most of our African-centered scholars only focus on African culture and history, some African American history, but very few African American culture or new African culture. I stressed before that this culture is the culture of popular choice in the United States and in the world. And it is the most complex culture in the US, maybe the most complex in the world, because this country, certainly demographically, when it comes to cultural groups, has the most complex cultural mix, having just about every group represented in this country. So this culture had to be reworked, recreated here. So it took root here. Whereas European culture was simply brought with the Europeans or the Aryans. And so it's an import. And that I've stressed this before. That's why there's been no Euro-American art form created in this country, because this country's culture is a reproduction of Europe. Because we had to rework this culture in our souls and then reroot it in this soil, then what happens here is we create a culture that's organic, that operates like a living organism. And it develops an ability to collectively respond to alien circumstances, hostile circumstances, circumstances that hit our people and throw us off our gait or off our balance. And this has been the nature of the culture. So what are examples of this? When the enslavers tried to wipe out our culture, what do? We go inside our souls, and carrying Africa within us, as I pointed out before, enslaved Africans would go into their souls and think of various things that arise from the soul. That's the higher creative mind there, where God sits, and create stuff on the spur of the moment. Meaning it was an improvisation, but improvisation and an innovation, improvisation always comes out of something that already exists, and you're adding your own spin to it. So the African in America, couldn't possibly lose spirit. Spirit would drive us, as it drives all African people. And spirit is a reality for all people, but our cultures, African and New African, African Caribbean, African South America, Africans in Europe, Asia, is spirit-based. And most of our writings on our history, particularly ancient Africa, really leave that out by both Black scholars and white scholars. But it's kind of a shame when the African scholars and African American scholars leave it out. I mean, you can understand Kemet, spirit runs through all of it. Everything in Kemetic civilization is spirit-based. And it's only with the 18th dynasty and on, after you've had this Hyksos influence, that you see some secularization coming in. Art, up until the 18th dynasty and ancient Kemet, was all spirit-inspired. What's called art, the wall paintings, in the tombs of the pharaoh and other nobility or whatever, were testimonies to the spirits and to God. Every aspect of Kemetic culture, I pointed this out before, map making. The Kemites were very good at measuring the whole earth. They could put Khufu's pyramid on the dead center of the earth. It just so happened it was in Kemet. But the fact is, they could measure the earth to know it. But where did the measurement of the earth come from? Measuring heaven. Measuring heaven. Or looking at the speech patterns of the Kemites or Africans in general. Medu Neter, God speaks. And Medu Nefer, human speech that appropriate or approximates God's speech. In other words, speech has a divine origin. There ain't nothing in African civilization that is ancient or traditional that doesn't have that as its center point. So the African coming into America is going to draw on spirit resources the way you breathe. It's just natural to you, natural to you. And a big mistake that our historians make is to use as a reason for not covering spirit in African civilizations is because all other cultures in their beginning have a spirit grounding. And that's true. But very often, the ethos of those cultures, particularly Aryan culture, rules out the people who are practicing spiritness in their culture, practicing justice or goodness. You know what I mean? Because they may draw on spirits, but these spirits are divining for them how they can conquer somebody. You know what I mean? So just because someone else has something that you have, it doesn't mean you throw that out, especially when it is central to your culture. You hear me? Because that's where God is in the culture. So when the enslavers brought us into this country, that was an act of cultural recreation, of drawing from certain African things and then adding some things of our own suited to this circumstance. And then out of that, creating an art form, starting with the spiritual blues and bringing beauty in a situation where there's ugliness. So this was an organic response. You hear me? And it was when we were most African. So the stuff that we create in enslavement is the most beautiful stuff and the most African stuff, contrary to popular opinion. Again, an example of how our culture is organic and responds to circumstances, alien and hostile or whatever, is the experience of Thomas Dorsey, who was a blues musician from Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, and who decides to bring in the blues sound into gospel music in the 30s because Blacks are migrating from the South to the North and places like Chicago. Preachers don't want too much of that spirit in the church because it'll get out of control. God will take over. And so it's when Thomas Dorsey is touched by God after the death of his wife in pregnancy, where she loses the baby and loses her life, sitting at a piano with these long fingers that were really the fingers of a pianist. And suddenly comes to him, Precious Lord. And Precious Lord has on the one hand all the things that the spiritual blues is made up of. Sadness, but at the same time, an attempt to transcend it, to rise higher. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on. And so he trains Mahalia Jackson and James Cleveland, two of the baddest gospel singers ever, and sends them to Black churches. At first, they don't want to hear any of this. But once it catches on, then what happens is, because this culture is in our souls, then what happens is the old hush harbors of enslavement where Black men and women would put their heads under a bucket and bring down the spirit. Suddenly, the spirit is brought into the house where it had been confined to the basement, to the deacons' meetings. Now it's in the main church because Southern Blacks was demanding this. This was a cultural renaissance in the Black church or church. You hear me? And then that, of course, would lead to what we would call, Jeremiah Wright called, who's the dean of Afro-centric ministry, gospel blues, going back to its roots. And you'd have no Aretha Franklin without that. You'd have no soul without that. You'd have no rhythm and blues without that. You'd have no funk without that. And hip hop wouldn't have much to draw from without that, because this culture is rooted here in our souls and in the soil of this country. It's organic. So when the Harvard report provided a formula for destroying rhythm and blues labels by mainstreaming the music, they figured out how rhythm and blues labels like Motown and others had been able to build up musical empires, Black musical empires, by playing music that then crossed over from Black radio stations to white ones, and then built an audience that had a foundation of Black, but then encompassed a larger group of whites. And so they figured out the formula and gave it to the record companies. That's what Harvard's for. You know, you think it's a great honor to go to Harvard. Yeah, Harvard is about control. And the people who come out of Harvard, they're being trained to control. Now, some of us break away, you know. But others, our minds remain on the plantation. So what happens is then white record companies began to peel off Black singers from Black record companies. And they would actually have a few Blacks in their white record companies in charge of these Black singers. And after 2 or 3 songs, they would say they're passé and phase them out. Death of rhythm and blues. But what comes along as rhythm and blues is being weakened because of outside forces, not because it loses its beauty. Rhythm and blues is going to be beautiful forever, like the Pyramids. You hear me? The Temptations, they're going to be bad forever. You hear me? Marvin Gaye, huh? Aretha, huh? Forever. You hear me? But what then happens is the youth don't know that there's a move by Harvard to do in Black music. But as the Bronx are burning, as music programs are being shut down in Black schools, Black kids don't have the opportunity to learn how to play a trumpet or a saxophone or anything else. Then coming out of the Bronx from people like DJ Kool Herc from Jamaica, who begins to alter his accent and begins to take on some James Brown stuff. You know what I mean? And so he used that turntable from Jamaica, and then he begins to nurture something that is a part of what becomes rap. And what do these young people do when they come up with rap? They draw from a fundamental principle of African culture, the hip word. The word is the central principle of African culture. Again, bringing beauty where there was ugliness. And the earliest founders of hip hop had no idea of making money, but what they were into was bringing in beauty and artistry. And the same was true of the Black freedom, Black power, Black studies, Black Panther, Black Lives Matter movements. These are organic responses that also get planned. See, that's the whole thing about improvisation. There's 2 features to it. One is spontaneity. The other is organization. As Dizzy Gillespie said, it's spontaneous organization. That's what a good jazz musician does. That's what a good organizer does. That's what a good thinker does. That's what a good anything does. And so our first occasion is always going into our souls and coming up with something original and beautiful. That's a part of this whole creative impulse that we have. So by 1984, a very creative team of African-centered scholars operating out of this organic response, coming out of this choice between two cultures. They don't have this analysis, but they know that there's a need for us to go back to our roots. They know that Black communities are being broken up. They know that we're in trouble. And so there's an organic response coming from African-centered scholars. And they launch an African-centered cultural renaissance centered on the deepest parts of African culture and African civilization, centered around ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. And it's important to note that most of the African-centered scholars were not political organizers or political analysts. A few were, but most were not. But they understood that our people needed a certain kind of healing medicine, and some of them, of course, were psychologists. And someone like Asa Hilliard, educational psychologist, because again, I'm going to do this astrology thing. He was born between Virgo and Leo, you know, and so he had this mixture. So people like that, they end up being dual in what they do. So he wasn't just an educator or a psychologist, he was both. And so they could see where going into the deep roots of our culture could be healing. And so this was important, and it would give our people correct information for correct cultural choices. So most of the scholars who launched the African-centered cultural renaissance come out of Black studies departments. And this is very important in the United States. And they would become then the center of attack from various Eurocentric centers who wanted to wipe this out. And they drew from, our African-centered scholars, I was a part of this, drew from the legacies of some that I've just mentioned, Martin R. Delaney, George James. His book, Stolen Legacy, plays a big role in launching this renaissance. And Marcus Bookstore in San Francisco contributed to this renaissance by republishing Stolen Legacy. And in fact, scholars like him are doing what Diop and Obenga would do later. And they didn't know about them until later, because they're coming out of the Francophone reality. And so they don't know a lot about speakers who are coming out of this English thing, just like a lot of us don't, read or write in French, though Dr. Leonard Jeffries and some others do. So those who launched this African-centered cultural renaissance are inspired by the older scholars that includes, as its master scholar, William Leo Hansberry, who was the best historian on ancient African civilization of his time. And that was John Henry Clark's major master, And so the 1980 cultural renaissance, the thinkers are key. Now, this is a key thing to get straight. We have the Black freedom, Black power movements that come out of the 60s, And then we have a Pan-African movement, or a movement towards one Africa, that develops in the 70s. And at that time, you have African Liberation Day. There's a lot of support for liberation movements in Africa. I took part in that. We would have African Liberation Days of 25, 30,000, the group that I led, Pan-African People's Organization. And these rallies around the country in May to support armed struggles in Africa occurred around the country. So that was a part of the movement in the 70s. But we reach a point in the 70s where there's a lull, and there's not any clear direction in the movement. And that lull is going to later lead into the 80s, that leads to this African-centered movement and others. And there are two groups that are really key in breaking this lull in the end of the 70s and the 80s. The National Black United Front, that's formed in 1980 in Brooklyn, New York, and ASCAT, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, that is pushing African-centered thought, particularly centered around ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. But the center of this, in terms of the African-centered intellectuals for this period, are Professor John Henry Clark, Dr. Asa Hilliard, Marimba Ani, Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Leonard and Rosalind Jeffries, Professor Jane Smalls, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Professor Joseph Ben Yochanan, Dr. Finch, and others. And my role was both as a scholar and as an organizer. Now, the central inspiration for the African-centered cultural renaissance and the African educational movement arises out of the 7th Pan-African Congress of Prehistory, held in December 1971 in Egypt, or Kemet. This Congress was sponsored by the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. This Congress was historically significant because the world's leading authorities on Africa assembled to discuss one question: who were the ancient Egyptians? Now, this assembly was only possible because of a shift of power in the world. Because prior to the movements for liberation in the 60s and on, the African independence movements, and the rise of the Black freedom, Black power movements in the United States, and prior to the decline of the West caused by 2 major world wars, there's no way in the world that a UNESCO would even be sponsoring a conference like this. And there's no way in the world that Africans are going to be in a position where they can challenge this officially. We already knew who the Egyptians were, at least those of us who knew our history. Some of us have been watching Elizabeth Taylor and Carlton Heston and others. And so, others who were playing the role of the pharaoh, and so who were white. And so some of us really didn't know that Kemet, Egypt, was a Black or African civilization. But most of us who were informed did. But to challenge Eurocentric thought and come up and challenge them and be on a footing where we could actually record their defeat, this required some power. And it's only with the shift of power in the world that this is possible. The rise of Africa, the rise of Asia, the rise of Afro-America. And so it puts us in a position where we can now formally rewrite our history. We rewriting it before. Carter G. Woodson, Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. There's a whole bunch of us are scholars who were doing this. But the point is now on a global scale, we can face them off and see who wins. Those battles are already won. When you enter that arena, you've already lost. You know what I mean? If you're on the wrong side. So the world's foremost European scholars assemble at this UNESCO meeting in Kemet. It's a whole bunch of them. But there's only 2 representing us, and that's all we needed. You know what I mean? When truth is facing falsehood, all you need is some good defenders of the truth, practitioners of the truth, knowers of the truth, those who be the truth. And so we know that those 2 who defend the position that Egypt or Kemet was Black was the leading person in this group was the leader of the African-centered cultural renaissance, of the 80s and on to this day. Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, a physicist, linguist, and historian, who is, Dr. Obenga said, coming out of the Mooric tradition, which is an African branch of Islam, drew heavily on that wisdom of God that is within and produced some magnificent work and was himself a magnificent human being. So he's leading this group, and he brought along his best apprentice, Dr. Theophil Obenga, who was a historian, linguist, philosopher, and paleontologist, as well as a poet and done some archaeological studies and others. You know? So when Dr. Diop and Dr. Obenga present their evidence, it's wide-ranging. Their evidence consisted of anthropological, archaeological, photographic, which means the pictures of the people that didn't lie, melanin dosage tests that would show the amount of melanin in the person. And when Dr. Diop performs melanin dosage tests on some of the pharaohs, but when he wanted to get in and just do a general set of tests in the Egyptian museum, the Egyptians didn't want to allow that. I wonder why. They looked at blood groupings, showing that the blood groupings of the Kemites was the same as the blood groupings of blacks in general. They looked at the writings of classical writers, including Herodotus, who said, for the Kemites are like the Colchians, they have black skin and woolly hair. And as Dr. Obenga points out, the very name of Egypt, Kemet, is a charcoal black person, meaning a black person. But that the Greeks, when they used to describe the color of the Kemites, the word that they used was a word that has only one meaning, black, according to Dr. Obenga, who speaks and writes Greek. They also used biblical sources. They threw their own stuff at them. Of course, Christianity isn't a Western religion. It comes from the Hebrews. Y'all do know that, don't you? But they threw that at them. And then they looked at cultural data and linguistic evidence. All of this conclusively proved that the Kemites were black. Now, who else in the world has got to even have this argument? Are you going to get up there and question whether or not the Europeans were white? Though you have a case where in the beginning they weren't, you know. The Twa were the first people all over the world. But is that going to be your argument? Or are you going to have a symposium on where the Chinese? We had to have this because of the fact that when people have power to control your present, they rewrite your past. And so this was a case of, you know, correcting it. So at the end of this conference, only one conclusion could be reached. So UNESCO's conclusion was reached, and I'm quoting them in the following words. Although the preparatory working paper sent out by UNESCO, this was the announcement to the scholars that this is what you must prepare for and do to enter this debate. You must come in with the documentation in these categories. So he says, although the preparatory working paper sent out by UNESCO gave particulars of what was desired, not all participants had prepared communications, meaning none of the white participants, he's being nice, because if one of them had come up with solid arguments, they would have noted it. They said, although the preparatory working paper sent out by UNESCO gave particulars on what was desired, not all participants had prepared communications comparable to the painstakingly researched contributions of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop and Obenga. There was consequently a real lack of balance in the discussions. That's an understatement. Huh? What an understatement. So what they were really saying, if we want to put this in street terms, was that the defenders of the position that Kemet was either white or Asiatic couldn't support that. And therefore, they got their intellectual behinds kicked, you know? The reason that the European scholars were defeated on the question of who were the ancient Kemites is that they didn't have truth on their side. The only reason that Kemet was turned white is because of the colonization of African history. Just as they colonized the continent, they went through colonizing the past, rewriting it and falsifying it. So with this newborn power that Africans are beginning to acquire, not only politically through independence movements, but mentally and psychologically through the freeing of our minds, we were able to establish this so that this is not a question anymore. Now, some will still try and raise it, but the blackness of Kemet, as Dr. Obenga says, isn't an issue anymore. This was Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop's central mission in life. And with the assistance of Dr. Theophil Obenga, he achieved his objective and achieved it well with great dignity and great beauty. So this great victory, while it was great, the information it was based on wasn't new to anyone of us who knew our history. You know, we already knew this, but it was important for the world. But this victory would have some real meaning for Black folks who were being invaded by drugs, whose children were filling up jails and prisons, and in a society where the rich were getting richer and more Blacks and people of color were being driven into poverty. So the fact that Blacks were undergoing a situation of hostile attacks from external forces in our communities and in African nations, from an unjust, uncivilized European, Euro-American system, meant that this message provided some important cultural ammunition for our people as we were working to revitalize our families and our communities and to make the right cultural choices. So this meant that Black children and Black parents who were living during the era of the generation gap needed a knowledge of Africa's historical past so that they will know that we have a great history in the past, but it's an indication that we're a great people who can do even greater things today and tomorrow. And this would help us in seeing our own creative power, which is the essence of power, our thoughts that enable us to create ourselves. We can recreate a new sense of ourself and of our identity. So in 1982, important historical events occur that bring in the political component of the African-centered movement. One was the formation of the National Black United Front in 1980, where we met in Brooklyn, New York, and formed a major national organization that had chapters in different parts of the country. And around that same time was the action of one of the chapters of the National Black United Front, the Portland chapter, led by a brother named Ron Herndon, a beautiful brother, who had led a Black educational organization, an independent Black school prior to that. And as a community organizer, decided, along with other community groups in Portland, that they wanted to improve the education of Black children in all areas so that they can have a quality curriculum in math, science, language arts, and so forth, but that they also wanted to see that their children could have a rich education in their own history and culture. So the Black United Front chapter in Portland, Oregon, launched an 85% effective school boycott in a city that didn't have a lot of Blacks, not then and not now. And so this was a major achievement. And so as a result of the success of this boycott of the schools, the school district decided to accede to the demands of the Black United Front and other groups that supported it, to hire Dr. Asa Hilliard as a chief consultant for what became the African American baseline essays, and which would be a move under Dr. Hilliard's instruction and coordination to bring in a team of African-centered scholars to develop a curriculum in all areas of the public school curriculum. And this right here is a summary, a manual on the African American baseline essays. And so from 1980 to 1984, Dr. Hilliard brought in African American scholars in all areas of the curriculum. And so this included mathematics, African American contributions to science, technology, African and African American contributions to social studies or history, African and African American contributions in arts, traditions and development, and African and African American contributions to language arts. Now, the key thing is all of these baseline essays had a Kemetic focus. They had an Egyptian and then an African and then an African American focus, but heavily centered around Kemetic civilization and Kemetic culture. Now, baseline essays are summaries that are used in shaping curriculum. So each of these curriculum areas was about 100 pages, but over a 4-year period of shaping them. So it was a lot of work that went into them. So I'll give you just how demanding this work was. Professor John Henry Clark was in charge of social studies, which is history. Heavily ancient African history, but also African American history. Now, when I talked to Asa about this, I asked him, well, how's it going? This is in the midst of the project, around 82, 83. He said, well, so we're talking about the different areas because we had some Black scientists who were dealing with stuff and, you know, the sciences, and we had some mathematicians and so forth. So I was asking him about John Henry Clark. And he told me John Henry Clark had 17 experts assisting him. I said, what would John Henry Clark need with 17 experts? He said he wanted to make sure that this was thorough. You understand? So every one of these curriculum areas had that kind of backup. And that's why it took so long, because they were doing rigorous research. It wasn't just off the top of their head. And so by 1984, these baseline essays are completed in Portland, Oregon. So in my second presentation on the series entitled Rules for Building Black Power in Alien University and Black Community Spaces, I noted that for Black Studies departments, it was essential to control your intellectual space. And in last week's show, I noted that the spirit space was the most important space to claim if you're going to make the logical mind the servant of the higher spirit mind. In all of these shows, I stress that the ultimate space of power for Black folks is the community space that Black people need to control, a difficult space to control in America, given the American white power structures' ability to come in and really make that a hard thing to do. So again, to control space, whether it's university, the public schools, or the community, we need to control our minds that enable us to then control these neighborhoods or these other spaces in the public schools. So in shaping a position on these baseline essays that could be useful in our communities, because these essays had been shaped for the Portland public schools, local organizations like the Pan-African Peoples Organization and others like the East that had existed before under a brother named Jitu Weusi, and national organizations like the National Black United Front provided the power base for shaping strategies and tactics, in this case, for shaping the African and African-American baseline essays. And it provided the arena in which we could begin to shape paradigms and models for just societies that could begin to serve as alternatives to these unjust models that are running this country, including the ones that run the educational system. Because the educational system, not just at the university system, is designed to train people to reproduce the society. And if it's an unjust society, you're going to be training people to work in jobs that they may have to work in, but that are propping up your oppression. I'm not saying you shouldn't work. I'm just simply saying that's the nature of what education is designed to do. And as Carter G. Woodson said, to put your minds on remote control, so you won't even think about what you're doing. You just do it. So in 1983, as one of the co-founders of the National Black United Front, Reverend Herbert Daughtry was the other. Jitu Weusi was the architect. Reverend Herbert Daughtry became national chair for a couple of years. Ron Herndon became secretary, and I was like one of the four founders. Jitu Weusi was the field marshal. He was the person who played the major role in bringing the groups together. And he was my good friend, a beautiful brother. And his skills had been shaped heavily in CORE. And he had been involved in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville campaign for community control of the schools. He was then called Les Campbell. He was over 6'4". He later renamed himself Jitu Weusi, which meant big black. He was a beautiful brother. He was also a lover of jazz. And in creating the East, he created an independent black school. He created a news arm, Black News, a news magazine that came out once a month. He had a program for jazz, and he created a cultural festival that still exists in Brooklyn, in New York. And a street was named after him last year, which he deserved. Brother passed on a couple of years ago, and I accidentally introduced him to his second wife, which was the best thing that ever happened to either one of them, according to the wife and according to Jitu. So when these essays are completed, as National Vice Chair of the National Black United Front, I decided that I was going to put before the organization the proposal that we take this up as a national project for African-centered education in the public schools. So we have Black studies that's now beginning to move into the transition to African-centered studies at the university level. We need them in the public schools. Now, in Berkeley, California, as chair of Black Studies, I worked with a beautiful brother named Richard Davies. Richard Davies, to my knowledge, had the only Black Studies department in a high school. and had real strong curriculum, had all kinds of backup. Beautiful brother. And he was raising his children, one of whom became a professional football player, another of which got a PhD, I think, in history, and then his daughter. And so I would come out to the school and speak and work with him and everything else. So that's the kind of thing we wanted around the country. And by the way, one of the best organizers in Black Lives Matter was influenced by, she says so, by the education she got at Berkeley High. And Richard Navies played a major influence on her. You know what I mean? Dr. Melina Abdullah, the leader of the largest of the Black Lives Matter movements in the United States, when Trump was being booted out, over 100,000 people. I called her. She said, well, I spoke before 100,000 people. Kind of reminds me of the Million Man March. I said, yeah. I said, except it's a part of a movement. It's bad, sister. Keep on keeping on. So that's what we wanted to do inside the public schools. And so I began to shape what became the World African-Centered Educational Plan. This was shaped in 1987 in the Black United Front. It's a multi-platform plan that consisted of 10 parts. I'll go into it in a minute. And so that became a debate within the National Black United Front. But the key thing is, I had an objective within this plan. There was an objective not stated. And the objective was to stick up in the public school system some of the best of our culture in all areas of the curriculum that's just been laid out, so that we could provide for our students an alternative to this Eurocentric cultural model that is based on racism, that is based on domination and control and oppression. And in a society in which the demographics were shifting, that at some point, the model for running the society had to shift. And so this was the real point of the worldwide African-centered educational movement that I'll get into in a minute. But a part of the ability to do this shift had to do with transformations going on inside of each of us who were involved in the movement. Because the whole point I was making around the discussion around power, which is the ability of your thoughts to shape who you are and to discover through piping into God's mind higher truths formerly hidden that can aid in the advancement of humanity and in bringing balance to the earth and the cosmos. So our ability to shape these kind of movements had a lot to do with what were we doing to internalize these very values within ourselves. So in 1984, in the midst of this great Afrocentric cultural renaissance, I've told you before, I'm given a call. I get a call from Professor Ray Richardson telling me I had to chair Black Studies, something I didn't want to do. You know, I went to state to teach and then in the community to organize and write. And so, she called me up, told me Black Studies been good for you. She's one of the two key reasons that I was teaching out there. So I had to do it. I didn't want to do it, but it turns out to have been a blessing in disguise for me. And it's at this time that I discover in my 17-year marriage that my wife, who's a good person, she had been experiencing mental illness, which is delusion, thinking things are happening that aren't, and never realizing this. Some people who are delusional come to realize it. And then at the same time, my sister is having trouble raising her daughter. She's around 12 years old. She's entering the rebellious phase. And so she drops her off at my house to raise her for the next 7 years. Now, that's what families do, but this was not the best time. But so I have all these things. There were some other things also piled on top of this. When crisis in your life comes, they usually don't come one at a time. They come in piles, because that's why it's called a crisis, you know? And I'm saying all of this to say that movements for change don't mean much if there's not internal change going on with the people who are, trying to make the change. You got the first changes inside yourself. So when I was talking about last week that power is the ability to create our thoughts, and through our thoughts, create ourselves. Personal crisis, test your purpose for being, and can either help you raise your thoughts to higher levels, or you can sink into why did it happen to me, bitterness and everything else, and just lay in the mud. So crisis is an opportunity. It's one at the time you'd rather not have. But if you can negotiate it right, you'll later look back on it and say it was the most important experience of your life. So my test, in the midst of a great cultural renaissance that could help save our people from sinking into Aryan or Eurocentric cultural mud and a cesspool. So for our people going through this crisis, the question is, how could we draw from the best of what we have inside of ourselves and our history and our culture to be more creative people that can rise to a higher level, that can take advantage of this crisis to become stronger? So the test for each of us individually is the same. And so for the test for me was, how was I going to draw from the best of new African and African cultural values, spiritual values, to allow my personal crisis to become an opportunity for personal growth and development? Now, I can tell you in the beginning, that isn't how I viewed it. But what I did view was that as I pointed out before, my wife's problem revealed mine. She had mental illness. She had no control over that, and we got her some help. But I had a problem that I couldn't see, that someone I'd lived with for 17 years had these problems. And as an astrologer who knows something about the internal makeup of myself, I knew why, I knew that I was strong, as I said before, on the masculine, weak on the feminine. And that's, of course, the issue with a lot of men, but this was particular to me. And I know men that don't have this issue. My best friend, K.N.D. Solowazi, he didn't have this kind of problem. If he had faced this, he would have negotiated it easily, because he had balance in that area of his life. And a lot of other Black men do, and some don't. And a lot of you sisters will say a whole lot. So I knew that I had internal work that I had to do in the midst of all these movements that I'm a part of, And what was helping me through is that for years, I had been internalizing central principles of Dogon and Kemetic and New African philosophy. And I stated this before, but I want to take this to another level. The key principle that helped me negotiate this crisis, and this is a part of being able to empower ourselves through our thoughts that enable us to create ourselves. We have to be able to transcend, to rise above a situation and draw from the highest thoughts that will enable us to not only negotiate crisis, but to transcend the space that we're in this case, the community space that's undergoing attacks on our culture and on our people, and to draw from the best of our culture to rise above it, and university spaces, where alien cultures are being taught in the classroom, and to be able to provide alternatives. and in the public schools, being able to do the same thing. So for years, I had been internalizing Dogon, Kemetic, and African American cultural principles centered around twinness. And this was key because I had been trained, as too many of us are, to think in an either or, good or bad framework. And so it was a transformation of philosophy that led to a transformation of attitude and thought patterns that would enable me to move from an either or, masculine or feminine, good or bad, Plato and Puritan kind of philosophy, which basically Plato created the system of what's on the top and what's on the bottom, reasons on the top and emotions on the bottom. He did these kind of splits, these separations. And so it was over a period of time that I was reconditioning my philosophy and thought pattern to think that, to feel that, to say that, to be that. That when I was talking about bad, I understood it was good, not just because it's an expression, it's a state of mind. Inside of one is the other. I was beginning to internalize this Dogon principle of the masculine is the feminine. It's the synthesis where if you're a male, more masculine, female, more feminine, but it's the working of both. And that's balance. When you get that, it's balance. And in the Kemetic sense, they have this thing called Djeba, D-J-E-B-A, which is the union of Ra and Osiris, or Asar. And so it's the notion of Ra representing the rising sun and Asar or Osiris representing the setting sun. And so this notion is translated as life, which is Ra, at the setting of the sun is slow dying, and death is a rebirth to a new life. And so it's thinking in cosmic terms, which are terms where things are linked and that lead to change. And that's a cosmic mindset as opposed to the Descartes Cartesian mindset where everything is separate and everything is in order, and reason, the lower mind, is in charge of the higher mind. And so this reconditioning of my philosophy and thought pattern from the lower logical mind to the higher spirit mind, through the experience of the light especially, but this 15 months of retreats over 5 years, 3 months a year on my breaks during the summer, and then the work I was doing throughout while I'm involved in these movements was leading to a transformation. And so my personal life crisis led to this 5-year period of self-cultivation and an ability to work out more internal balance. In the midst of this internal crisis between 1984 and 1988, upon the completion of the African American baseline essays as national chair of the Black United Front, I started a debate within NBUF, the National Black United Front, about the need to launch a world Afrocentric educational plan to save Black communities, Black families, and Black youth from Eurocentric cultural quicksand, and to get us to have a basis for drawing from some deep strengths that lie within ourselves, within our history, within our culture. So it'd take me 3 years to convince the National Black United Front to move on this project. I won't go into all the stuff that we had to do to get them to move to that point. But the key point is my strategic assessment was that the African American baseline essays would be the central point for an African-centered educational movement that would be worldwide. And This movement was timed to coincide with the United Nations and UNESCO's World Decade of Culture for the years of 1987 to 1997. This wouldn't mean that the movement would stop at 1997, but it meant we would be aligning this movement with a drive in the African world towards an appreciation and understanding, and in my case, internalization of African culture, African and African American cultural principles. So this decade of culture set up by UNESCO coincided with the African-centered cultural renaissance and the African-centered educational movement. So what did this worldwide African-centered educational plan include? One, the restructuring of public schools to include the African-American baseline essays and other school reforms to provide quality education for Black youth and youth of color. That's one. Two, the creation and expanding of independent Black schools. I was running one. Ron Herndon was running one. And Jitu Weusi had just finished running his Uhuru Sasa School out of the East. And we had a host of other people in the Black United Front who were engaged in education. And so that was the second component, was to build and expand upon independent Black schools. The third was to develop mass-based Saturday schools using the W.B. Du Bois Learning Center that came out of Kansas City, Missouri, initiated by Brother Leon Dixon, a friend of mine, who's a mathematician. I think he was 6 units short of a PhD in mathematics. He just didn't go for it. He wasn't interested in getting the PhD. A real brilliant brother, real nice brother. The W.B. Du Bois Learning Center is the premier after-school program in the United States. It's operated for close to 30 years now, with hundreds of students going through it each year, and with teachers coming from the suburbs, Black teachers, volunteering their time on weekends to teach all the subject areas in the curriculum: math, science, history, culture, language arts, music. So this would be a model for how other communities could do the same thing. And I would say, and this is part of the reason I'm doing this right now, is this movement has some components that we need to revisit today. And the Saturday school is one of the most important components for our youth, because it provides a place where we can up their skills and consciousness. And at a time where you're dealing with a computerized technotronic system, train them in some high-tech skills that whether they go to college or not, they can use. And most of the young people that come through the W.B. Du Bois Learning Center end up going to college, but you don't have to. But we need to up the skill level as well as the cultural knowledge and understanding of our youth. Another component of this movement was the study group movement. And that was one that was already spreading, and we helped to push it a little bit further. And then at that time, when you got your knowledge through Black bookstores, the expansion of and support for existing Black bookstores. So the central purpose of this movement was the public school component of this movement. And the idea of the public school component is, I thought that strategically this would be a workable strategy because the system wasn't prepared for it. If we had come with an effort to control the public schools, we would have to have controlled our neighborhoods better. Would have been a hard battle to win. And we had tried it in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. But if we were going to really push the envelope, in this case, we had to do it in a way in which the system was unprepared for it. And I figured we'd have about 3 years before the system could wire up its response. And that's about the way it worked. And so the idea was to put before various school systems across the country this African-American baseline essay proposal. And we ended up getting it in numerous cities around the country. And some of the premier ones were in Detroit, where we had a brother who was on the Board of Education, supportive of the Black United Front, and they set up a number of theme schools named after African-American people. Kansas City was the biggest achievement for the Black United Front, where they took over a number of high schools and for over 12 years ran them with an achievement level higher than any schools in the United States. In Oakland, myself, Dr. Wade Nobles working with us, Mr. Oscar Wright, who was co-chair along with me and another person of the Black United Front called Buffer, Black United Front for Educational Reform. We took over McClymonds High School and shaped a curriculum there. And so in different parts of the country, this happened. And in the case of New York, Adelaide Sanford, who had been a public school principal, had retired and went to Harvard, working there in her retirement. She was brought back to New York to be a part of the New York State Board of Education, and she initiated a project to create African-centered, Native American, Asian, Latino curriculum in the public schools. And Dr. Leonard Jeffries was brought in as the primary consultant. And it was there that Arthur Schlesinger, who in the leaflet that we have for the show, his book is came up with this book called The Disuniting of America. Now, interestingly enough, this book in its first edition was sponsored by, of all things, Federal Express. Now, since when does a business sponsor a book like this? And it's called The Disuniting of America. It was an attack on the African-American baseline essay project. So you have right here, Federal Express. Can you imagine? This is telling you that the response in opposing the African-centered educational movement was coming from corporations. And because at the same time, we're making this same shift in Black Studies in 1990 at San Francisco State, and the Hoover Institute, along with the California State University system, comes after us. The Hoover Institute and groups like this are think tanks for corporations. And so think tanks are driving the opposition to African-centered studies. And they're trying to knock the legs out of this movement because the scholars came out of Black studies that had moved to African-centered studies. So Leonard Jeffries comes under attack at City College of New York. Molefi Asante comes under attack at Temple. The Center for Inner City Studies, where Jacob Carruthers taught, and where Dr. Conrad Worrell, who was chair of the National Black United Front, taught and later administered their department, which Jake did at one time as well, came under attack. There's a guy named Stephen Howe, who's a British scholar, wrote a book, and the book was on identifying the African-centered scholars so that they could be attacked and destroyed. And the same thing with Diane Ravitch, who is brought forward as a person who's a scholar who's supposed to be able to prove that Egypt wasn't Black and that this scholarship that we were putting forward was bogus. The only thing is she had no training in this area, didn't know what she was talking about. And then Arthur Schlesinger's book, The Disuniting of America, a book that is really a propaganda book. Schlesinger was a American historian with a master's degree, not a PhD, but his father had been also a noted American historian. And he had been in the Kennedy administration, Arthur Schlesinger. And so his book was basically saying that the African-centered curriculum project and the Afrocentric movement in general was threatening to disunite America. And he made the comment in his book, because I reread this thing a couple of weeks ago, preparing for the show. I read it years ago. I went back and read it. And he said, while I know nothing about African history, especially ancient African history, the people who do tell me that the Egyptians were not black. What kind of bull is this? You know what I mean? And then they have pictures. I won't go into it, but they have a picture of Leonard Jeffries. He's got the biggest picture in this book, this propaganda book. By the way, the one that's sponsored by Federal Express, a brother named LeGrand Cligg, coming out of LA, one of our African-centered scholars, organized a boycott against that book. And that book stopped publishing because Federal Express didn't want to lose their business from Black folks. And so then it was put out again in another form. And by the way, the publishers of this book, The Disuniting of America, published corporate books. So the corporations were really behind this. And by the way, this book, Disuniting of America, the Federal Express version and the new version, was sent to every educational department in a college or university in the United States. And its main aim was to attack the African-American baseline essays and to attack the African, Native American, Latino, Asian curriculum set up under the leadership or direction of Adelaide Sanford, with these various scholars coming in, Leonard Jeffries leading the way on that. So the point is, the reaction to this was heavy because, using my strategy, it was a strategy to put up not just information in the public schools, a paradigm, an alternative to this mad Eurocentric paradigm, a paradigm that would begin to lay the groundwork for the changing of the guard in this country. Since systems of education reproduce their society, this is putting forward a paradigm for a shift in how this society is going to be run. Instead of a Francis Bacon empirical science method for science, and there's nothing wrong with empirical science when it comes to just observing nature, but when it's used for the purpose to control nature and to create a new nature, that was Francis Bacon's stated objective, then what you have is a mad, what I call, and Jacob Carruthers had called it before me, a mad philosophy of science. And that science now threatens the very existence of Mother Nature and Mother Earth, because it's waging war on Big Mama. And so when we're putting forward the model for African science, which Native Americans could do the same thing, Asians could do the same thing, this is a science that is operating in harmony with nature. And its ultimate objective is to see that we protect nature, not destroy it. And so to save the planet, literally, there has to be a change in the paradigms that run this country. And in this case, the paradigm of science. The same with political science. So the social science component that Professor John Henry Clark headed up, the real deal underneath that was and is that the system of political science used in the West, coming from John Locke, is a system of controlling the people so that a majority of the people can continue to get rich, so that whites can be mystified with the idea that you're white and you're right, and you get a gun to keep Black people in check, you know? So that was the Bacon Rebellion principle. When Blacks rose up with whites against the system, that sent a chill down the spines of the rulers of this country. And so, in order to stop that from happening again, whites were given certain privileges. The first one was whiteness. And they were told that, if they were indentured servants, once they were through with indentured servitude, that they could have a gun and they could have something to grow a crop with, but that their essential responsibility was to protect the existing order, an existing order that had led them to rebel, because after the War of Independence, when they come back to their little plots of land, they've been taxed. And how could they be paying taxes when they're out fighting a war of independence? And this was an anti-Indian rebellion, because Bacon's rebellion was probably inspired by white settlers who felt that the federal government wasn't giving them enough gunpowder, meaning troops, to kill Native Americans. But the key point is the order, the existing status quo that Schlesinger wants to defend, which he calls a melting pot. He wants us to melt, but he wants us to melt in Eurocentrism. He pats on the head any African American scholars who buy into that, but any who are challenging that and saying that this system of oppression is based on a model that needs to go out the window, where the rich are getting rich, the poor are getting poor, blacks and people of color are treated as though we're not human beings, and that we need a new paradigm for a new shift of power. So this was basically what the African educational movement was about, and this was the threat that was posed by the African-centered cultural renaissance. And as I pointed out, in the case of the Hoover Institute, we defeated them. And in the case of the center in Chicago, because Conrad Worrell was a faculty member there and an organizer, they defeated them. And in the case of Molefi Asante, who was sat down for a while, he was at least able to get his position back. Unfortunately, Dr. Leonard Jeffries lost his position, not his tenured position, but his department. That was largely, as I pointed out before, not organizing in the right way. You don't go to court when you fight these things. You go to the streets. So the point is, and I want to conclude on this, topic of this show has been Black Power and Afro-centrism is thinking beyond the Aryan cultural model. We need to draw from the depths of the best of our culture so we can revitalize our families and communities and nations and strengthen the nations of Africa and the Caribbean. And part of that is through seeing that our children receive an education that empowers them to be creative, to love, to know and think for themselves, and to begin to be prepared to run the society that they live in. So we're still faced with these same hostile forces. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Hotep. Now, I want to encourage people to subscribe to this show. And you have here under the screen the places you can go to donate to the Dr. Obitashaka Show Cash App, Dr. Obitashaka Show. And this show is on every Saturday at 10 a.m. So let's look at the comments, see if we got any here. Black Voltron Reloaded, I already linked and share the broadcast on Twitter on my way into the live stream. Thank you, brother. Let's see if we got anything else here. Lady KX Mosley, peace and love, family. Hey, lady, enjoy all of your Facebook posts and the work that you and your husband are doing. You know, Brother Shabazz, can you clarify? Is African American culture any more complex than Haitian or Jamaican culture? I would say that they all have a unique and shared complexity. Yes, I would. And the reason I would say that is the circumstance. While we're drawing from a common base, which is African, and in the case of Jamaican and Haitian culture, it's dropped right in there. So they didn't have to do the reworking that we had to do. The environment in which our culture is developed culturally is the most complex in the world. And so we're dealing with every kind of ethnic group that you can deal with in the world. Almost every ethnic group that's in the world is in this country. And yet this culture is the culture of popular choice of this country. So there's a beauty to that. There's a reason why different ethnic groups would draw from it, particularly of color and youth that are white especially. Part of it has to do with the beauty. Part of it has to do with its ability to respond to complex circumstances. So recreating something is itself a complexity, very different from continuing something. So the continuation of African culture in the Caribbean, and there are new mixtures because they bring in, for example, Indian rites into their spirit systems, into voodoo. But, and you know, there's the Spanish, but mainly French overlay. But essentially, that is traditional African culture dropped into the Caribbean setting with revisions that come out of oppression, some not good, like here, you know, colorism, classism that, you know, come out of slavery. And of course, we had our own classism in Africa of a different type. So for example, the San Francisco Freedom Movement, which is a mirror of the society, or the Black Panther Party and the way they had to respond to the realities they face, or Black Lives Matter. The way these movements interact with different cultural groups while providing leadership for it, including whites. That's a complexity. Now, there was a complexity in Haiti as well. I'm not saying they aren't complex, but yeah, I think it's the most complex in the world. It's so complex. Let me put it this way. I don't care how much you study it, you'll never know all of it. And the reason is there's so many dimensions to it. For example, my best friend's an artist, a painter, and he does other woodwork and stuff. That's his painting in the back with the booty dance, the bump. It's called the bump. Or there's the theater arts component of our culture, or the depths of jazz, which is a new African cultural creation, along with the art form in general. In fact, in the African Caribbean setting, the popular culture is basically African. You know what I mean? Basically African. It's got the new twinge of the Caribbean setting. We had to recreate a new one based on African principles, but it's new creation: spiritual blues, gospel, rhythm and blues, funk, soul, hip hop, which has a Caribbean element to it. Kool Herc and others come out of the Caribbean. They make their contribution. So recreating a culture is a more complex work than continuing one, though they're both important. And the key thing is, the best proof of the pie is in the pudding of creativity. The new African is by nature creative, and the most creative African on the planet, and Africans say that, not just us. And this isn't putting down other cultures. I'm just saying the only reason why we're more creative is we had to be. We had to recreate a culture here. You know what I mean? It's circumstance. We ain't any better than anybody else. And our oppression isn't any worse. Some of us will say it was. No, the only thing worse is you had more whites here to stick it to you, so you can make that worse, you know. But they all have complexity. I agree with that. But yeah, complexity, this is the baby, brother, you know. And we haven't even bothered as a people to assess it. And most of our scholars haven't studied it. Some have. One of the best books on African American culture is Exchanging Country Marks. You should read that, you know. Excellent book on the formation of African American culture in the United States. Brother Ogawa. The Harvard Report, a study of the soul music environment prepared for Columbia Group, is available now for purchase. Oh, good. Thank you. LaShonda Henderson, what do you think caused the lull in the 70s? Was it the death of leaders or did it go underground? There were a lot of causes for the lull in the 70s. I would say the first one was that we weren't clear on where the movement should go after 68, because in the South, it had been clear that the objective of the Southern freedom movement was a right to vote and ending segregation. When that happened, then the movement is not clear where it should go after that. And so if you look at any of the movements, if you look at SNCC, for example, or CORE, or King's organization, in the case of SNCC, you know, you had people who, like Bob Moses, who I think was the best organizer produced in SNCC, and he was the apprentice of Ella Baker, a beautiful brother. He ends up going to Tanzania and works in the Ujamaa villages for a while, gets his PhD in mathematics, and then does the algebra project, which he was doing to his death, and worked with Dave Dennis, who was a core field secretary, a great organizer. And he has a son that looks just like him, you know, and stayed working in Mississippi, Dave Dennis. He's the one that brought core into Mississippi. Worst place to organize in the United States because it was the bloodiest, you know. So that was one response of SNCC was the response of Bob Moses. And then you have Kwame Ture, who becomes a public spokesman for Black Power. And then because of the attack carried out against him, moves to Africa for a while, studies under Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, adopting both their names, Kwame Ture. And so he embraces a form of Pan-Africanism with a Marxist spin to it, but focusing heavily on Africa. And so you have the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And then you have people like John Lewis, who after the shift to Black Power, leaves SNCC and becomes more part of the system and becomes a congressman, you know, and a person who had played an important role in SNCC, and a bunch of other things. So there was no clear idea of where the movement would go after 68, after 65. Now, in the case of King, King sees the need to restructure the society, and he becomes a radical. But the only one close to him is James Bevells within his organization. And he's the one that gives Minister Louis Farrakhan the idea for the Million Man March, and was the major person pushing King inside of SCLC to take a strong stand on the war in Vietnam. So one of the problems, and then CORE had the same thing. Some of us went the way of the Garvey thrust. Some of us went into economic development. Someone went into political organizing. The chapter in Cleveland is the first to get a Black mayor elected, Carl Stokes, but the Ford Foundation also supported that. But that was a good move in that Black people wanted Black mayors. But a lot of the people who became Black mayors were not Black militants. So part of the problem that would produce the lull is a lack of clarity on where the movement should go after 65. Part of it is that a sector of the movement moves into the Pan-Africanist thrust while organizing at the local level. And our organization, Pan-African People's Organization, was one. Many others did this. And so we ended up with African liberation support work. We also had the 6th Pan-African Congress held in Tanzania, which was, again, a reflection of this shift to Pan-Africanism, a shift that Malcolm favored. But what happens in the African Liberation Support Committee is an ideological struggle breaks out between Marxists and nationalists. And I would guess that the state had something to do with this. And it leads to a splintering of the African Liberation Support Committee by the end of the 70s and the decimation of the Black Political Assembly that Amiri Baraka had headed up, because he becomes an orthodox, extreme Maoist, and then evens out as a Marxist. And I respect Amiri Baraka, and I know that this wasn't any state intervention. He's Libra, and he tended to go to extremes and then cool out. He was a good brother, but a lot of groups fell as a result of that. So part of the lull was caused by this. It was caused by internal conflicts and external, I think, forces that help antagonize those conflicts. So when we move into the 80s, it's when, with the formation of the National Black United Front, and there are other groups as well, Minister Farrakhan's trying to reorganize his nation, his part of the Nation of Islam, and other groups, there's beginning to develop some kind of direction. Now, the key point that I didn't stress in this presentation is what ends up happening in the late 70s is scholars become leaders, because now you don't have any leading organizations. That's good and bad. I didn't particularly like it because I like John Henry Clark, but John Henry Clark wasn't a leader, but he was viewed as a leader. You know what I mean? And it was good because he had good message, but he didn't have a good political message. He didn't have one because he was a scholar. Where should the movement go? This and that. He wasn't involved. And in fact, I think he made a big mistake in not going to the 6th Pan-African Congress. Kwame Ture didn't either. And I was thinking it was because the great scholar C.L.R. James had been excluded from the Trinidad delegation. But then I went back through my notes because I took a lot of notes on John. We would be at meetings. I'd take notes on him. I got a tape where I interviewed him on Nkrumah. You know, I was apprenticing under it. John didn't go because he didn't like the struggle between the Marxists and the nationalists. John was a precise person that could have helped with that because he was both a socialist and a nationalist, you know. But more important, that was the largest assembly of Africans on the African continent. It would have been good if John was there, and it would have been good if Kwame Ture was there. I ended up chairing the political committee of the 6th Pan-African Congress. And if you look at the picture that introduces the show, there's a bunch of pictures. There's one of 3 people. I'm in the middle, and on my left is Amiri Baraka, and on my right is a brother named Owusu Sadakawa. I have taped that, and I printed it into a little booklet. It was a debate. It was a 2-line struggle inside of the 6th Pan-African Congress. We had the largest delegation of Africans in the world. And so it was on Marxism versus Pan-Africanism and nationalism. And I kicked both of their butts, kicked them to the ground, because Baraka did not really know Marxism at that point. And Owusu didn't read. Owusu was a good, smart public speaker, but he had no substance. You know what I mean? And so 6-pack was important. And the most important thing about 6-pack is I chaired the political committee. That was the most important committee in the Congress because of the way the Congress went. The most important committee should have been the Science and Technology Committee. which my friend Bulalela Wabogo, who helped me with the 6-fold stages to mental freedom, helped shape. He's a chemist. He was on that, committee. Why was that important? Because at that time in Tanzania, you had some of the most skilled Africans in the United States in Tanzania doing work to help develop the country. And, Bob Moses was just one. One of our leaders in Pan-African People's Organization was a brother named Mzee Robeson. Mzee Robeson was in charge of the School of Pharmacology. He was from Chicago in Tanzania. He was a member of the Pan-African People's Organization. We had a chapter in Tanzania. So the fact that Africa could not really take advantage of that, and Nyerere wanted to, but there were conflicts that he had inside his own government. There was other things that happened during the Congress that I won't go through that made almost tied his hands. And by the way, the people who organized the 6th Pan-African Congress came out of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Cortland Cox, he was in charge of the administration of the 6th Pan-African Congress because they had an African Skills Project in Tanzania. How have the Chinese developed? They've developed by drawing from overseas Chinese. The money of overseas Chinese especially, and the skills. When Deng Xiaoping carried out his modernization, he was using a lot of capital coming from overseas Chinese and skills. And the neighboring countries that had been colonized by the British, they were Chinese, like Hong Kong, right? And we got the greatest skill bank of any Africans in the world. We need more of them, and the Black colleges have produced most of them. Africa needs it for its development. But there was a lot of suspicion coming from people like Sekou Touré because he was under attack. The Portuguese had him under attack. Amilcar Cabral's base was in Guinea. And so there was a real concern about him protecting his own base, which is understandable, but he was suspicious of the African from America, So, and a lot of this suspicion helped to be fostered by your friendly branch of the Central Ignorance Agency, the CIA. I won't go into some of the stuff they were pulling. So all I'm saying is that Pan-Africanism was a part of what was happening just before the lull period, and Six-Pack was a ripe opportunity for making linkages and stuff. And some of us did. In Six-Pack, my organization, Pan-African People's Organization, and a group we formed after it, the Pan-African Secretariat, formed linkages with Blacks in the United Kingdom. And we formed linkages with other groups, and we worked with them to this day in organizing. And I'm alive because of that. I told you this, low intensity and peacekeeping operations. I learned that by listening to what was going on there, but reading Kitson's book on low intensity and peacekeeping operations, but generally seeing how America operated with its cousin, the British. And I'm in and out of Britain all the time. I got a wife from Britain. So, what do you think of that? She's not from Britain. She's born in Britain, but she's Caribbean. You know what I mean? Huh? So I would say there were a lot of contributing facts to the lull period. It was a period where we had not really decided on where the next phase of the struggle would go. And I'd say the biggest problem is, one we still have, is figuring out what the long-term objective is. That's the key one, Brother Kamari, you and your wife, I really look forward to meeting both of you because the knowledge that you've got, some of that I ain't got. I need to learn. A lot of this stuff on, full spectrum dominance. And, I'm getting ready to get into some of those books. And your lady, you two of you are birds of a feather. So I definitely want to meet both of you. physically. And I think it would be good if we hooked up on Google and we could just see each other and talk. But I really appreciate both of you, you know what I mean, as well as a lot of the other conscious brothers and sisters on this program. That's why I'm doing the show. When I get it hooked up with folks like you, I say, oh, yeah. Lao Tzu, question, should we use the essays to transform the public school systems in our community? I reached out to Portland Education Board a few years ago. They are no longer using the baseline essays. Yeah, but they need to be updated. But basically, they're good. I have all of them, but it's reproducing them that's a problem, you know. And there are people around the country that have a few of them. So I could probably work out some way that they could become available. Yeah, I think that they would be useful, but you have to do some organizing in your communities to make that possible. And what I didn't point out was that our most successful move around implementing these essays in the public schools and generally gaining power in the public schools came through the Kansas City Black United Front chapter. And they've now shifted leadership. They've changed the guard to younger people. But that chapter was our best chapter because it had a team of really good people. The chair of the chapter has a master's degree in structural engineering, the Jamu Webster. He's a black belt in karate, a real nice, humble brother. The brother who heads up the W.B. Du Bois Learning Center, a mathematician, and then another brother who's a lawyer, and then, you know, the other people that make up the chapter. But what they did that was effective, because part of what I was doing with this African-centered educational movement is it was an exercise in jazz. So what I was doing was improvising to see what are the soft points? Where can we do something that will really work? And so I think that the model for how it works when you're going to get a curriculum into the public schools, I think Kansas City provides the best model. And how do they do it? They just put one person on the Board of Education, just one person. But that just one person was somebody who was conscious. It was a sister who was able to form alliances and coalitions. And as a result, they took over a number of public schools and produced a whole lot of excellent learning and brought in people like Wade Nobles and James Smalls and my former student, Kuji Chagalia, who's been on this show, who's a revolutionary, to train teachers. You know what I mean? So I want to do some leadership training on this show and bring in people, younger people who have skills, who can do the training. It's not just us old heads, and do a collaboration. And this is one of the things we should be training people in, both how to get the curriculum into the public schools, but also how to build these Saturday schools. I think the Saturday school is the most important thing you can do, because you can do this on a mass-based level. If you got people in them who have skills, you know, that they can transfer. Our youth need a transformation of skills, and they need a re-education so that their horizons change. It's not limited to just a few things. And a lot of our youth already have that. You got a huge number going to college and a number who have skills, but a lot who don't. So the W.B. Du Bois Learning Center is the place for training people in that. Leon Dixon has written a book on this, The Future in Our Hands, W.B. Du Bois Learning Center. And he's not willing to run around the country, but he's willing to do it on Google or StreamYard or whatever to exchange this information. We've talked about it. So, yeah, you know, I think on both levels. But you got to build a base of power in your community, because your biggest budget in a city is a public school budget. So your biggest resistance is going to come from those who are eating from the public school financial trough. You know, Bruce Watkins, we must start or continue to control our communities. We have lost so much in the last 30, 40 years. We must gain control of the resources, schools, businesses, families for our next generation. That's a good point. That's a good point. And I would say this, and I've been pushing this forever. And we did this in San Francisco. I'm not doing it because we did it. It's the most important kind of organizing, especially when you have a Black community. Some Black communities have been wiped out, but then we've reformed Black communities. And in a place like Chicago, you still got something like 600,000 Black folks. It's down from what it used to be, but 600,000 is nothing small. You know what I mean? So Ella Baker's model for organizing was a group-centered leadership model. And she liked the cell structure, but she never was able to put it into effect. She couldn't in the NAACP because they were a top-down organization. And so the top tried to control the bottom. I consider Ella Baker and Malcolm to be the best two organizers we produced in the 20th century. But she never did it. And SNCC had the opportunity. Had I been in Mississippi, I wouldn't have done a Mississippi Summer Project. I wouldn't have done that. I would have done a block project. I would have done block, what we did in San Francisco. And so what we need to do is organize block structures. But the block structures have to be bottom-up structures, and they have to be connected and systematic and controlled by the people. And so there's also got to be a lot of transformation of consciousness as well as training of people in skills. When we did it in San Francisco, we had poverty money. And I never took a dime, but I put people I've told you before in charge. A guy named Will Usser is a draftsman, and he laid out the project. I have the book. He doesn't. I kept it. And it's good. My study is 400 feet here. That book would take up half of that because he's laid out how you organize from the block to the district all the way to the city. We organized 45,000 Black people like that. The Panthers were advised to do it by James Foreman, the 10-10 system. He saw it in Guinea. They didn't do it. You know what I mean? And that is your best format for organizing, because where's power? It's with the people. And if you got compact communities, do that. If you have pockets, do that. Wherever it is, you know, do that. But that's hard work. We like to do this flashy stuff. You know what I mean? The marches and stuff. Now, the marches are good because with Black Lives Matter, they adapted that King style to their struggle. And then Ella Baker formed a group-centered leadership. I'm not knocking that. But I'm saying that ain't how you build real power in the community. That's a response you need to keep too, that one. Because if you can put Black folks in motion in 50 cities and 50 countries, that's nothing to play with. That's good. But you need to go beyond that. So I agree with you. But I would say block organizing is important. Brother Kamari is making the point. Accurate historical reference and context provides is so important in our analysis. Very true. Very, very true. Whether it's pretty or not. You know what I mean? Yeah. Spencer Smith. I'm glad to see some new names. Robin, glad to see you again. Spencer Smith, could you speak to the idea of personal transcendence to a higher sense of values and obligations from an African point of view compared to Europeanized Christian ideas on salvation and supremacy? Yeah. That's what the last show was on. You know what I mean? Transcendence. On the one hand, I would say it's built into our culture. If you look at somebody like John Coltrane, he was about transcendence and rising above like his addictions, his weaknesses and whatnot. But his music was played primarily to take people above what he called the corrupt moral system, the corrupt system of the West. He was very conscious of that. So in our culture, we have some ideas of that. So transcendence The last time I was talking about how you need to link up reason with intuition, these two, and you need to put intuition of the higher mind in charge. Our culture's wired for that. And I would say one of the biggest challenges for a person who comes out of Black culture, who's gone into spaces like the university, where this whole system is despiritualized, is to be able to hold on to their spirit essence, to hold on to it. That means they got to really appreciate it. Because if you don't, then you get captured by this intellectualized, categorizing everything. Don't get me wrong, categorizing okay, but that is what you think is advanced thinking, you know. So I would say part of that. The values that come out of both African and African American culture, that is spirit-based, moral-based, those are very important to draw from. So I think that the general conclusion among Blacks who have embraced Afrocentricity to embrace Ma'at is correct, because that is what our parents have taught us to be right and straight and truthful. They just didn't call it Ma'at. If you told them Ma'at, they say, Matt, what? But then tell them what it is. Oh, yes, baby. And your behind knows what it is. You know what I mean? So, yeah, transcendence. Transcendence is taking your state of consciousness, wherever you are, and working on going to the next level. So the sixfold stages to mental freedom chart these stages. The first one, not all go through it, assimilation. You got to get out of that one, because that's the one that they reproduced. They made people into their image. And then there's pre-disturbance and disturbance. And when you go through it, you'll understand what that is. There's Black identity that parallels assimilation. That is, some of our people come through Black identity. Some come through assimilation. King came through Black identity. Malcolm came through assimilation. The majority of his family came through Black identity. You know, that's an interesting one. And then they brought him back to Black, and then he transcended to African consciousness and revolutionary consciousness, to African identity and revolutionary consciousness. So part of this is based on your stage of consciousness and what you do with it. Now, most of us in the 60s, we discovered this. We underwent awakening, and then Boone and Layla and I were able to track this. Malcolm underwent this. He couldn't have told you what the stages were at the time of his assassination, though he had gone through them, because he hadn't sat back and reflected on it. But he definitely had gone through them. And he was a natural revolutionary. This is astrological too. He was in the solely lunar phase that's revolutionary. That's the last phase of the moon before the new moon. Garvey was in that phase. Lenin was in that phase. It's the phase where you want to build tightly organized groups. You know what I mean? That's generally how people coming out. It's a prophetic phase. My best friend is in that. He's not a revolutionary, but he has this prophetic ability. He'll tell you what's going to happen. He told me 2 years before Trump got elected, brother, Trump's going to get elected. I'm not a prophet, so I can't prophesize anything. And he said, it's going to be good. What he meant was it was going to put some heat on us. You know what I mean? He didn't mean it was good, but it meant it was going to force us to do some things. So part of that transcendence is transcending your state of consciousness and going to the next level. And then this one of linking spirit to reason, that is what our culture is based on, and African culture is based on. And that is transcending to a different mindset, a mindset where spirit governs and reason is operating under the direction of spirit. Brother Shabazz, Haitian voodoo is incredibly complex. It wasn't just a reproduction of Benin, Togo, Ghana source. Yeah, that's true. And I would also say that voodoo is definitely more complex than Christianity, definitely. But also powerful, because it's feeding into spirit power. which is African in general. And being a mixture of African spirit systems, that's a complexity in of itself. So yeah, you're right. But that don't mean that the overall system is more complex though. But I would say, yeah, you definitely got it when it comes to the spirit system. And that is a powerful component of the whole thing. Brother Shabazz, Michael Gomez, he's given the name of the author of Exchanging Country Marks. Yeah, that's a masterwork. It's an outstanding work. And chapter 6 in the Integration Trap, I drew from his work as well as a lot of others, which is the chapter that deals with the formation of African American culture. Shepsu Heru, Big Brother, has a comment. I believe that the reason for Haiti failure has to do with the Catholic education, which created an opposing army which combated the original voodoo liberators. This book on Black Spartacus that's come out recently on the Haitian Revolution, I think, gives a real good insight into that, where it's showing the complexity of Toussaint, who is both a voodoo master, herbalist, but a master and a Catholic, and speaks his own traditional African language as well as the language of the people of Haiti, as well as French. But Catholicism played a big part in his assimilation. And that was his weakness. That was his weakness. But then there's a class of people that are assimilated. And I would say it's more than the religion. I would say it's also the color issue, and the identification with white blood. And that has led to a brutal caste system in Haiti, similar to some of the stuff we've had in Louisiana, because fathers could privilege light-skinned children over the black slaves, and even see that they got an education in France and all this kind of stuff. And so that was a step below anything that Toussaint faced, because Toussaint was a complexity. He loved blacks. So it was not an assimilation of self-hate. There's levels of assimilation. So that was a complexity for him. Yeah, but yeah, you got a point there. I would say that the main reason for the failure of what happened in Haiti was the murder of Dessalines, because Dessalines carried the best of the Haitian culture and vision. And his 3 policies, which Jacob Carruthers, in his magnificent book on the Haitian Revolution, he made the point that there were 3 policies that Dessalines put forward. The one that anyone from Haiti that had a drop of black blood in them was black. No more colored simulados, all of this. The second was that only blacks could own land. And the third was, and this was what got him killed by the elite, both black and white, was that the land should be equitably shared. He had the power because under Toussaint, the generals got big plantations. So did Dessalines. But Dessalines' policy was to break that up. It was to equitably distribute the land. The elite, both dark and light skinned, went along with the first 2 policies. That meant that they were the sole possessors of the land and of the wealth. But the third one meant that there couldn't be any privileges. He got killed for that. And he had actually improved on communalism, which is the sharing of land, air, and water. He added equitable to it when he had the power to have as much of it as he wanted. That was a true revolutionary, Dessalines, James Pooh, Black Metamorphosis, an Africana cultural invention in the Americas, to Cedric Robinson, In Search of Order, The Myth of Political Science. and Francis Bacon, big data. Okay. He's citing some stuff that's important. And you made some important points last week, Brother Clue. Thank you, Robin. Bruce Watkins. Yes, Brother Tashaka. This is what the beliefs and actions have been for hundreds of years. Principles of superiority and control. The narrative is changing. Those factors will not dominate. Yeah, the narrative has to change as the worldview changes. And I'm with King and Malcolm. This place has to be restructured. Whatever else you want to do that. You want to go back to Africa. If there's an opportunity to form some separate states, if that opportunity exists, I don't see it right now, but if it does, who knows? But this place has to be restructured. And on the best of African and New African principles and Native American. And there's some Asian principles that are good. Tao, good principle. Brother Shabazz, this is timely. We're in a small town in Illinois and want to make some Afro-centric Pan-African education moves. Yeah, good. Is there some reading on block structure? Okay, that's a good question. I haven't published it, but I did a 99-page paper, Strategies and Tactics for Building a Mass-Based Black United Front, where I lay out some of the things that have to happen with block structure. That's one. And the structure that we laid out in San Francisco, we haven't published it, but I have the copy of what Will Ussery laid out. That's another. That's actually worked. We're the only ones that have done it in the country. Political parties do it, or the Irish machine in Chicago do it, but us as a Black Liberation Strategy, no. The CDRs, Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, those are the committees organized in Cuba to defend the blocks. I studied those when I was in Cuba. I was at 83, 84, representing the National Black United Front with Reverend Herbert Dougherty and Reverend Brown. So see what you can find on that. The way in which the Vietnamese organized, they used a cell structure. The key thing about cell structures is they should not be structures that are used by an elite to control the people, because in Cuba, for example, those are structures to ward off invasion, but they also keep an eye on people on the block. You know what I mean? And that ain't the purpose of it. And by the way, this is the best structure for economic development. This is the best structure also for dealing with gangs. I won't go into how, but it's the best structure. But it takes hard work, and you have to train people in this. James Pooh, doesn't nature follow the age grade system? Ancestors to elders, adults, which is wisdom, adults, knowledge, to youth, information, to children, data. Shouldn't we be led by wise elders, not impetuous youth? Okay. Yeah, what I'd say is the age grade system that James Pooh is talking about is among the most just systems outside of the hunter-gatherer society structure that Africans created. And they were created in societies without kings or queens. And so people transition from one age group to the other. Chancellor Williams describes that in his book, Destruction of Black Civilization. So that's a good structure. That's not the structure that's going to end up working for us now, but that's a good structure. The principles of it should be drawn from. And elders should be respected. But in African culture, elders didn't have the final say. The people did. Y'all know that? Yeah, because when I uncovered the principle for just societies, that all the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society, that was the key to balanced family systems that I call twinlineal. But it also is the key to just societies. And those that form immediately after the hunter-gatherer phase, which continues, but it moves to another level, which is agrarian. Some of those first ones were those age grade societies, or they were village societies where the village made decisions based on consensus. That's the African form of democracy. So they would consider the wisdom of the elders the recommendation, but the elders couldn't dictate. The whole people had to agree. And I think that's the best. And remember, in revolutionary times, the youth play a special role. And you just can't be having them just subordinate to elders when they're putting their lives on the line. But they should definitely be listening. And good youth who are engaged in struggle are seeking advice and seeking wisdom and go for the truth wherever they found it. That's why our movement in San Francisco was successful, you know. And in fact, one of my best advisors is a guy named John DeWambia, who was the best advisor, the guy that woke me up, Norman Brown, former member of the Nation of Islam. He gave me some of my best ideas, would give me spankings when I went too hard on something. And he looked like a Muslim. If it's a duck, if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck. But he wasn't a Muslim duck. But he had Islam in him, dressed just like him. But he was thinking stuff all the time, was a master organizer. So, you know, drawing from wisdom wherever it comes from. You know, in Medu Neter, they talk about how wisdom can be found even in the marketplace, they say, among the market women. I would say especially in the marketplace, especially among everyday Black people. That's where the real wisdom is, everyday people. You know what I mean? But wherever it is, Coltrane's principle, even the worst musician can teach you something. They know something you don't. Listen to them. Okay, Spencer Smith, staying in our spiritual reasoning lifts us in our transcendence. Yeah, very true. Yeah, working on ourselves because we're all imperfect. We all got issues, weaknesses. And I would say one of the best areas for growth is in relationships. Good relationships. And no relationships are perfect, but that's where the real growth is, you know. Sisters finding brothers that are compatible to them, brothers finding sisters who are compatible to them. I know some of you have that. That's the best. And if you don't, that's fine. But if you do, that's where real growth occurs. But from my marriage to my first wife, I wouldn't have undergone the growth I went through. So some people would say, yeah, but if you knew she had mental illness, would you have married her? Well, that's a good question. I didn't. And there was a reason I didn't. I needed to learn. In the end, it turned out that it was good that I was blind because it enabled me to see. And I think that was a destiny compact worked out in heaven. I know when she got to the other side, she definitely could see it. So, you know, yeah, relationships, you know, that's where the greatest growth occurs. Movements, yeah, but relationships, because your partner is going to see things in you don't see. My wife right now, she's giving me some real good advice. She told me in the beginning I should do this show. It wasn't that I wasn't listening, I just didn't want to. It was when I got in a circumstance where I had some choices where I decided to, but she could see it in the beginning. You know what I mean? Good mates are like that. You know what I mean? I think that's it. These are good comments. I really appreciate it. And I would hope that people would think about making a contribution to the show. This is no preacher up here. I'm not trying to enrich myself. I'm taking care of myself just fine. I've never taken money for any movement I've led, but I did get financing for Papo from Black businesses. And I'm not above getting some financial support for this because I do not want to go to corporations to get money from them through advertisement. I fight corporations. So why should I be advertising some deodorant or some liquor or some stuff? I'm trying to bring beauty in here. when the hell do I want to have all this ugliness up in there? You know what I mean? So help out on that and encourage people to subscribe. And we're going to have some new strategies that I'm going to discuss with my team for increasing subscribers. Lawrence Freelo gave me a real good idea. He's got a bunch of them because he's a real pro in this. So let's see if there's anyone else up here. Thanks, Brother Watkins, for your comments. And LaShonda Henderson for your question. Brother Shabazz, it was a comment here. Harvard has ruined more Negroes than bad whiskey. Yeah. Why, you think you're not drunk. There's anything else up here? Okay, that appears to be it. I've enjoyed this. This rejuvenates me. And yeah, let's stay in contact. Encourage people to watch the show. Hotep.